Hello, everyone. I'm Shawnta Jackson, and welcome to today's live discussion. Our topic today is equity in education. And my guest that's joining me today is Stephanie Tellez, and Stephanie is a educator, actually a classroom teacher by training and by experience. And then also she is an education advocate. And thank you, Stephanie, for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Yes. I've been reading and studying and just to make sure that I'm abreast and that we can have a nice and robust conversation and just kind of just researching different things about the school to prison pipeline, um, exactly what equity in education means. My background, just a little bit about me. I do have a master's in public health, and in public health, we refer to these different factors that influence your life outcomes, and your quality of life, and also your health outcomes and your quality of health. And that's called the social determinants of health. And so with the social determinants of health, basically what that says is the places that so where you live, your income status, your level of education, your access to health care, your access to quality health care, quality education, your I think I probably just said it, but your income, environmental factors. There's all of these different social and structure factors that determine your life outcomes or your health outcomes, and education is one. And so that's why I have you on today. And let's just get started. Tell me a little bit about you first before I go into my first question.
Sure. So I was actually born overseas in Germany. My parents met in the military. My mom is Latina. My dad is Black. And then after serving some time in Germany, my parents came back to New York, and they were there for a while, and we ended up moving to Virginia, which is where I spent most of my primary education and part of middle school. Got a younger brother, and we moved to California when I was in seventh grade. And going from Virginia, very conservative area, but mostly military bases where there was a lot of diversity. Moved to Southern California, to Orange County, and I had never seen so many white people in my life. And it was so different, not just to see so many white people, but to go into a classroom. And I've never had a Black teacher since I've been here. And so even in college, my only Black professor was my African American Studies professor, because I went to school in Southern California. And so it was just such a stark difference with the culture of the school. I mean, my neighborhood, very different. But I went into education, and I just finished my 14th year teaching special education, predominantly Hispanic school population, primarily Spanish-speaking families. And it's just been a blessing that I am bilingual. I can't even imagine how much harder it would be to connect with families without that. The language barrier, I see so many other educators struggling to communicate with their families, or families who want to be involved and don't feel like they can be. And so for me, families really just become a focus of education, because without the families, I only have your kids for a couple hours a day. They truly are the main support for their children. And I have two kids of my own, and I live in the same little town we moved to so many years ago. And it's changed. It's not as white anymore. And it's definitely not super diverse, but my children are having a little bit of a different experience. But the teaching population demographic has not changed.
Okay. And the same for me. I'm thinking about my K through 12 education. In seventh grade, I had a Black teacher, my English teacher, Mrs. Bass. Be is am are was were been how has have had shoot all that good stuff. I don't know. Anyway, I had her, and then in high school, my history teacher. And I recall asking my Black History. I mean, it was Black History Month, and I recall asking her, "Why is it that every year all we learn about is slavery and Harriet Tubman?"
Mm.
And the Black teacher shrugged her shoulders at me, like, and no, I don't. She's not here to speak for herself, but that's an experience that I have. And so one of the things that I guess one of the points that I want to make, or something that I want to bring up, is the fact that, and so I'm thinking about the book, The Miseducation of the Negro. And even if teachers, even if you are a teacher of color,
Mm-hmm.
you are going to regurgitate the same information and the same, and just keep the same system of oppression going as your oppressors, then you're not doing anything for your race or for your community. Do you agree?
I agree that if you only follow the provided curriculum, absolutely. If you do not take the time to pull apart the state standards and to find other books that I mean, there are lots of textbooks, lots of books you can get in your own school library that you can use as part of your curriculum that still teach the standard, but the material and the content is a little different. And so I think if you are not at a place as a teacher, but especially as a teacher of color, that you are going out of your way, which unfortunately is something we have to do, right? So ethnic studies is this big push right now. And let's do ethnic studies from preschool through 12th grade. But until that becomes universal, I really believe as educators, you have the responsibility to go above and beyond. And I think a great example is that the time we live in right now, this movement that is happening that in my lifetime I've never seen. You have communities who were silent before about police brutality, about public education, about the disparity, and depending on where your zip code was, determining how much funding you got and the resources. But you have folks speaking up who never spoke up before, and I can only speak to my own experiences. But like my son's in 4th grade, and his teacher, every year I'm that mom that's like, hey, I noticed, we don't have enough books on this topic, or it's Chinese New Year and we haven't talked about it. Like, and so she was responsive this year. Oh, you could come in and teach something if you want. And I just thought, but my son's white friends get to hear all about their European ancestry, and nobody's saying, come teach the kids that, right? That's your job as the teacher. That's what you signed up for. Mm-hmm. And so I think this movement, what it taught me with her in particular, is that she decided to start a book club. And so this is her first summer doing a book club. And she chose the book, The New Kid. And I was like, if you haven't heard The New Kid, it's about a story about a young Black man who moves into a predominantly white neighborhood and his school experience. And so they started book club, and my son and I are having these conversations. And yesterday was the meeting, and he said, Mommy, the teacher today said the word racist. And I was like, how do you feel? And he said, talking about a character in the story. But she said, I don't think I would have been as uncomfortable if she had talked about Black history more, because then she would have had to say racist during the school year. And I was like, wow, he's 10. Like, if he's uncomfortable as a young biracial child, knowing that I'm the mom he has, that we talk about racism, but it's the first teacher to actually do it. So I'm happy that she's stepping out of her comfort. But I'm also sad that there's only 10 out of, I think it was 30 kids in his class that signed up. So those other 20 kids aren't hearing it, and they aren't getting the perspective. And so it's a movement in a time for educators to step up and to really look at the curriculum they're being provided and to say, no, we want other books, and to push for that.
Okay. Now, let's talk about white privilege. Could you explain to me how white privilege impacts education and the education system?
So I think for me, what comes to mind immediately when I hear white privilege in schools is school to prison pipeline and bias. And the reason those things pop into my head is because when we discipline our students, if you just look at the research, right? So first of all, our Black skin in this country is weaponized immediately upon sight. We don't look at young Black boys as young boys the same way in which we look at young white boys, right? And so we see them as dangerous. We see them as criminals. And they're criminalized, especially you look at high school and the number of school resource officers, right? The number of contracts with police departments and public school systems. And so with the mindset already that they're a threat, you then institute zero tolerance policies, right? And so all these policies have been implemented from the 90s that basically say you here's an offense, here's the consequence, no matter what, and that's it. There's no room for understanding. There's no restorative practice. There's no opportunity to find out why is that student. For example, we have students who are coming to school late, right? I could show up late, but if the zero tolerance policy states I can only have 3 tardies before I get in-school suspension. After that, I then get out of school suspension. Like, you're removing children from the classroom where they're given opportunities to learn and figure out what they want to do in life and what skills they need, and putting them at home with most likely parents who are working or caregivers who are working, which then gives them opportunities to do other things that maybe we don't want them to be doing. And how do you explain the fact that we have a higher percentage of Black boys in juvenile detention halls, but they don't make up the larger percentage of Black boys in the country, right? And so that huge disparity percentage. But I really think not only that, but we don't address racial inequities and social justice inequities in schools the way in which I believe we should. So, for example, if I live in a predominantly white neighborhood, and my property taxes are funding my schools, right, which they do, I have access to a different pot of money. But I also have access to, for the most part, families who are second or third generational college graduates. I have access to, special ed alone. I'm a special ed teacher. The opportunities, the class size, things like that aren't offered in more less affluent areas because there isn't as much money. But on top of that, I look at districts and the turnaround of teaching staff is important, right? So if I have teachers who are frequently every 3 or 4 years leaving because they don't have the resources, they're stressed out, they're not sure what to do, nobody told them how to handle this, and they're leaving, I don't get experienced educators, right? So I have districts who have veteran staff who've been around 15, 20 years. And I'm not saying that's always positive, but it does show you that you build community amongst your colleagues. You build relationships with your administration. You build relationships with the school board. So that allows for that to happen and grow. So you can, as an educator, say, hey, I really think this program would benefit our students. I know my admin, I know the school board, and you have an easier path. Whereas you go to other districts and let's say the turnaround is high because you have more students of color, you have zero tolerance policies in place, that you're removing children. And you, as you know, when you come into teaching, most people are like, I am here for the kids. I am here to just teach and to drop this knowledge. But we don't talk about like how much we can learn from our students. And we definitely don't talk about prepping educators in college prep course and credential programs about what tools they will need that nobody's talking about, how to ask for those tools, right? So if I don't know how to deal with behavior because I've never ever had this type of classroom behavior or poor classroom management skills and how that's going to impact my teaching, and I'm more likely now to go to the office, go, I can't deal with this, go, because you rolled your eyes at me, like that's the problem.
And that's what I was waiting. I'm listening to you, and you mentioned restorative justice or restorative practices, and I want to talk about that. But first, what you were just saying about basically the students are being disciplined because of subjective things. This student is rude or being disobedient, and they're being punished, and it has nothing to, and it could be cultural differences. The majority of the teachers, to my understanding, the majorities of the teachers in this country are white women.
70% white females.
Okay, and so you have a little Black and brown bodies that these teachers are educating, and my son, when he was in junior high, his teacher told me that he was very disrespectful, and I said, well, please explain. And her definition of being disrespectful was my definition of emasculation, and I told her that you will not emasculate my little Black boy, my child, and he's not being. And I'm like listening to the situation, and I'm like, no, he's not being disrespectful. Like he's a young adult, he's a young guy. You have to respect him as well. You just don't, just for her. Anyway, it was subjective. And I actually was familiarizing myself with a study done in Texas in the education system. And I believe it was like 70% of the disciplinary actions that it was found to be that they were all subjective. And so with that said, let's talk about restorative justice. And if you could explain to the audience what that means.
So restorative justice and practices is basically something happens right? It could be any type of behavior incident. And your response to it, we're going to forget about the zero tolerance policy, and we're not going to just run you off to the office and wash our hands of it and we're done. You are actually going to take the time. And my disclaimer is I am not a licensed restorative practice trainer. So I just put that out there. But you as an educator and a school system are going to sit with that child and whoever else may be involved or other adults. So if it's between myself and a student, and you are going to restore the damage that's been done. And for most people, we think of restorative circles, right? So you're talking about your feelings, what happened before, but before you can even get there, you have had to have built trust. And so if my students trust that I am really here for their best interest, right? And I'm not here because I'm mad and I don't understand them or get their perspective, but I'm trusting that what happens in this circle is between us. And that conversation can lead to so many things. And so I think for me, it's easier to give an example. And so I teach early childhood, but I was on a K-5 campus for a long time. And a couple years ago, I had a 5th grade student. It wasn't my student, it was another teacher's student. And I kept seeing him in the office. And I just volunteered to the principal, like, can he just come help out in my class? Like, he could read to my younger kids. And the principal was like, yes, go. Like, basically, I don't have time to deal with him. And so I brought him to my room and I just said, hey, I just really need some help. Like, this kid over here, he just needs some help. Can you just read a story to him? And I told him my name and this and that. And he read the book to the child. And then he said, oh, do I have to leave now? And I said, do you want to leave? And he was like, no. I said, we don't have to leave. But since you're here, when my class leaves, like, let's do some work together. So I just said, show me the work that you're missing out on. And so we went through the work, and God help me because it was all Common Core, and like I was not a 5th grade math teacher, but we got through it. But in that process, I started asking, like, so what do you like to do outside of school? Like, how's life, this and that? And we built a relationship. And he was known as like the behavior problem in 5th grade. I mean, this is a student who was literally picking up chairs and chucking them at the teacher, right? And so because we've gone away in some districts, this whole like no suspension thing that we hear about all the time, some districts still do it, some aren't. So I happen to be in a district that's a 0 suspension. So they couldn't suspend him other than on campus, sending him to the office, but not writing down a suspension, but they couldn't send him home. And so we built the relationship and I started asking questions, why, what's going on? And come to find out, his mom was basically had a drug addiction issue. So she was in and out of his life. His father had been imprisoned and he was living with his grandmother who he didn't have a strong bond with. And so there was a lot of frustration in the household from him not being able to express himself, but he was coming to school and he would slam his bag down on the desk. He was getting kicked out of class for that. He would throw his pencil because he was mad. He was getting kicked out. So it just escalated from there. But once we built that rapport, and I said, you need to call his caregivers in. You need to have these conversations together. The teacher had to really take a step back and say, like, I had no idea that was happening at home. Now, my question is, how did you not know? This is your child. You have him 6 hours a day. Because you didn't want to know. And so restorative practice is about you truly wanting to understand the cause of any issues you have. But more importantly, that you're open to growing from that as an educator, but you're helping that child and you are centering your work in your child's well-being, your students' well-being.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And that story actually brings me to the discussion of equity versus equality. And it may be standard for some school districts. For example, we have 1 or 2 counselors or care teams at sometimes as it relates to mental health, they said care teams or care counselors or we may, it may be standard, but some schools, depending on the lived experiences of the children, of the students, some schools may need more resources than others.
Right.
And what can you explain for me what your definition or explain to me what the differences are between equality and equity in education?
So I would say equity. So first of all, so equality meaning every school is going to get the same number of textbooks. Every school is going to get, like you said, 2 counselors, 1 nurse. That's the standard. And for every state has their ed code to follow. So For me, if my ed code is like one nurse for every 1,200 students in the state of California, then that's just what every school district gets. But what if my school happens to be a severely handicapped school site with 500 kids who may have medical issues, may suffer from seizures, maybe tube fed, things like that? Is one nurse going to be enough? Right. So equity is giving every school every student what they need. Right. And so if I'm looking at class size, that's another one, a great one to look at. If class size is working where you are, when you have 24 students and one teacher in K-3, that's amazing. If that works for those students are making progress, they're accessing the curriculum, they're moving forward, their social emotional health needs are being met, their academic needs are being met, that's great. But you could go to the district next door where 24-1 just isn't enough to meet those same expectations you have of all children. So maybe you need 20-1, right? And so being able to modify what you're providing so that all students have the same opportunity at the end of the day. And I think what we mix up a lot of times is, well, everybody has the same book. Everybody has, 30 kids in a class. What should it matter if you have 30 and I have 30? All the kids have the same. But if your class of 30 was at grade level when school started, that's very different than my class of 30 who were on 3 or 4 different grade levels of reading when they started, right? And so you have to really consider like the trauma kids have had too. That comes to the classroom. So if I have students who've experienced more life trauma, and that can be a million different things, right? Perhaps I need more counselors at that school. Right. And we keep hearing defund the police. And people keep that to me, that just comes in this conversation because it's not about defunding and zero police in a community. We're saying take police officers out of schools. Why don't you take that money, the millions of dollars we're seeing on school budget lines, and say, if we're seeing the need for police at the high school, then at elementary and at preschool, why are we not fully funding more counselors? Why are we not providing more wraparound services? Why are we making parents jump through hoops, right? You have grandmothers who come to school sites and say, like, I really need help for this first grader. His behavior's out of control. I don't know what to do. And what do we say as educators? Oh, well, we only have this counselor and we don't see it at school yet, so we can't help. Or, oh, you can go to the county and look for resources. Rather than say, we have a budget and we can use this money because this is public funds. We have the ability as districts to negotiate with our teachers unions and say, we need more counselors, and not just any counselors. Like, we need counselors who are culturally aware of the differences in children and in homes. And so if we take the money and we look at equity and give everyone what they need from when they start school or even pre-K, you're going to see a positive impact on the back end, right? So I'm not saying it's an overnight solution where like you put counselors in this year and next year, all those high school seniors will be doing so much better. Like, you have to start from the bottom. And you also have to take into account with equity, if my lived experience as a student has been very negative with the school system and educators, you can't expect me to magically receive all these services as a high school student and erase all the damage that's been done.
Or even make high school, and even want to finish high school.
Man, that's why do I want to come to school when every time I'm here I'm in trouble?
Right. But then when they're out of school, their chances increase. I think it's like a 67% chance that they will, if they're introduced to the juvenile justice system, that they'll be reintroduced by the time they're 25, like they'll be in jail again. Right. So you're more likely to, if you drop out of school, you're more likely to be introduced to the criminal justice system. But as you mentioned, just the school to prison pipeline, you also, you talked a little bit about standard tests and standard scores. And what is it? Is it third grade? I know. Say it again.
Third grade is when it starts.
It is when it starts.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm not a statistician or like an educational researcher. However, I have enough sense to know that if I were the Bureau of Prisons or in corrections, I know to look at school stats and school outcomes. And if by the third grade or sixth grade, within this zip code or within this community, if these are the testing scores, I know that these are future inmates based off of just how everybody in the system is structured. And a lot of the things that you mentioned, you said, this is public funding. This is public funding, and you're also providing examples. So I appreciate that. And for everyone who's watching, this election year, in addition to voting for the president of the United States, in a lot of places, there are actually school board members who are running for re-election, or individuals who are running trying to be elected to serve on the school board. And traditionally, school boards, and I was reading from Race Forward, a report about the history of education, and traditionally school boards, the members were kind of like the elite, the businesses, members of the business community, and from my understanding, I believe it was, I hope I don't get this wrong on live. I can't remember if it was Thomas Jefferson or not, but one of the early presidents of the United States, probably Thomas Jefferson. Basically, when the public education system was developed, it was like a 2-track system. And so there was one track for kind of like the elite or the educated, and then there was another track for the workers. And it's important and the reason I mention this is I think that it's important for us to understand the original design of the school system. We were supposed to be good workers, not necessarily educated individuals, critical thinkers, and business owners and leaders within our communities. It was a kind of, these systems were set up to maintain the status that the oppressors had set in place to maintain their system that they built for themselves. And understanding that, and I think it's important for us to be intentional and do our research when we're voting for those elected officials within the school boards as well. And then also, and this is something that I have to do a better job of, I do participate in surveys, and I do read the information, and I do stay abreast of what's going on in my school district, but I have not attended a school board meeting.
So I have all these thoughts in my head. So my first is going back to state testing. I'm anti-state testing. I don't believe that we need to have these billion-dollar companies coming in, giving tests to tell us we need to do better. We know we need to do better. We see the kids as educators every day in the classroom. We know where the district needs to put more money. We know what resources we need, not Pearson or any other testing company out there that is making all this money and not returning that money back to schools, right? It's a profit, it's a business. And so it's another way to separate schools. When you look at segregation and parents are going online, right? The great schools, right? That's a website I hear parents say all the time. Oh, on great schools, you guys are a 3, but this district's a 10. Based off what? Right? And so when you break down what they're really looking at, you realize like, that's just a way to say, this is where the white kids go to school. This is where the other kids go to school. And that's really how it's broken down, and parents won't move. But as far as the state testing, like many parents don't know, I've got a 4th grader, just finished 4th grade and going to high school student. My kids have never taken a state test, because you have the right to write a letter to your school and say, I will opt my child out of all and any state testing practice, as well as the actual test. My kids have never done it. And so the district tried to push back and say, oh, your child needs this because it's going to help them learn to take tests like the SAT. So my response is, you test our kids weekly anyways. My kid isn't getting less practice. They're still having, because you have district benchmark tests, because that's the practice for the state test. And most districts do both. And so my kid's still getting that same opportunity. I mean, I've got very smart children who don't need another test. And so my children read during that time, or they go help in a younger grade level. And I'm okay with that. And also for school board races, we have 22 school board races just in California, seats that are up in November. But what happens is people, when they look at the ballot, they vote for the president, the vice president, and then all of a sudden you see a drop off. The lower down the ballot you get, the less people actually vote. And so we have to do better as community leaders to see who's running. And if it's a candidate we can get behind, that's great. If there is not a ballot of, a viable candidate, we need to push our own community members to run for school board. There's so much that school boards decide on policy that unfortunately a lot of times you're right, it is the elite folks in the community or the business owners who get on school board. Those are not necessarily the folks that we want to be making decisions for all students in a district. And so I really encourage people to find out who's running. Look, run yourself, walk the neighborhood. I mean, you are going to realize that the people have the power. And if you truly organize the people and get your message out and where you stand in your platform, people will respond. I mean, I just came off of two county board elections as treasurer. And so I've been to more school board meetings in my life than I ever thought I'd go to. And I'm telling you that even up north where we have billions and millions of dollars being thrown at school board candidates by the charter school system and all kinds of other people, we were able to get a classroom teacher elected and we ran against an incumbent. That's huge. Now, the amount of money that incumbent was given and raised was quadruple, if not more, than what we could do. But we won because we were in the community. There were families out walking on behalf of this person, and she was elected. And it was a big upset, but it was to show privatizers that you may have the money, but we have the people. And so I really, really, I feel strongly that school board elections matter.
Okay. And you mentioned charter schools. What's your opinion on charter versus private versus public schools?
Ooh. So we have different types of charters, right? And so when I look at dependent charters that are nonprofit as part of school districts that are unionized, it is very different than a for-profit unregulated charter. And so I think when you look at the research, and I'll just use New Orleans as an example. New Orleans prior to Katrina had truly public schools. After Katrina, what happens is you had billionaires come in with their private charters that were independent charters, right? So they weren't relying on the school district and things like that. They could make up their own rules. That started replacing because they had more money and didn't have to go through. When you build a school, there's all these steps through the state and the government, right? Mm-hmm. Well, when you're private, you can say, I have $1 billion. I'm going to build a school right here. I'm going to buy this land. I'm building my school. You don't have all this red tape to get through. It's not the same. You have, building code and things like that, but you don't have the same structures in place that make it easier and more available. You don't need school board permission to go to vote on things. But anyways, if you take that money that these billionaires came back into New Orleans and basically decimated their public school system. So now you have charter schools for profit that are all over the community. Parents no longer have a choice because the public school system could not rebuild fast enough. And so now you have these affluent billionaires who don't even live in the community, right? They're off in some other state making all this money, hiring teaching staff because teachers still needed jobs, right? So the pay is less, the benefits are different, and they're putting, and New Orleans is predominantly Black students, right? And so you're putting them into these schools that aren't providing the same resources that public schools had. But not only that, you have parents now who are assigned to certain schools. So I've actually met with some of the families. Oh my gosh, I cannot think of the name, but there's an organization of parents out there that are truly just amazing and organizing the community. But they have had to put students on buses for an hour to get to their charter because they can only go to that school. I mean, I've listened to students get on panels and say they have what's called silent lunch. And so as a teacher, I had to ask, what is silent lunch? And literally this 6th grade student said, their charter said, when they go to lunch, you must not talk. You go to lunch to eat. So you have 6th grade students. I don't know about you, but I know 6th graders and they can talk. And that's part of who they are. That's how they live. And so they have silent lunch. But because it's a private charter, there's no rule saying they can't do that, that's child abuse.
So how are the private funders, these schools, benefiting if it's a private charter school? Is the state still giving them money per pupil?
So every school, basically every student comes with, have you seen, there's the movie Backpack Full of Cash. Every student has a price tag in every state. And so if I'm taking your community students and I'm saying, hey, there's no public school that the parents chose they're coming here, that money follows that child. But when you're in a public school system, there's a breakdown on how that money, the percentage and things that have to be covered. But when I'm in a private system, I get to determine, how that money's spent. So maybe I want to spend more money on a really nice looking building, and I'm going to tell the parents they get a new laptop, and that's where my money's going to go. But my teacher salary is going to go down. The number of counselors is going to go down. And I'm not saying all charters are bad. That is not what I'm saying. There are some really great ones out there, but I'm talking about ones with the sole purpose is to make profit off of public education. I have a problem with. And so, it's just really sad because parents aren't aware of the background a lot of times. And parents really, they just want what's best for their child. So if you knock on my door and sell me the moon, and I'm like, yeah, I want my kid to go there, but I get there and it's not what you promised, I may not fully understand that I can leave. I may not understand how to maneuver that system to benefit my own child. So there just isn't enough regulations across the country on how charters move forward when you're looking at for-profit, and remembering that schools are publicly funded. So you're using public dollars to privatize education. And so that in itself, you no longer have a community school board, right, that gets to determine policy. You have your CEOs and who you determine should be on the board. And so you lose community voice when you have that.
And I'm probably sure that if I'm sure that there's some type of research that's already existing, but if an individual were to search and to identify that research, I'm pretty sure that there is some type of relationship between these. We know that for the school to prison pipeline, we know about it in the public education system, but it's not often talked about in the private charter school system. And so you also mentioned that there's a public charter school as well. And what's the difference between a public charter school and then a traditional public school?
So most charter schools are public schools. They are public in that anybody can go to them, or there's a lottery system to get in. So it's not that it's like a private school that has a list and a fee to get in, because you're not paying to go there. But the fund, right. And so the public, you have dependent charter schools, which are part of the school district and have to follow different rules like the regular schools do, in a sense. There's still some difference, but an independent charter that is solely functioning by itself, you have different types. So you have a for-profit, a nonprofit, and you have some great ones out there. There are some schools doing fabulous things. But when we look at private for-profit charters that are when their main goal is that this is a business and basically children are the objects or products of the business, you lose sight on what's best for those kids, because your main goal is, how do I provide the minimum to make the biggest buck? And so I think we really need to look at it and call it what it is. If you're going to private school, I understand that, going into that, I'm paying for a service. It is very different. You can't compare those two worlds. But if I'm assuming that this publicly funded charter is doing what's best for my child, and I don't understand that at the top, they have a CEO that's making X amount of dollars. You have the people under them. You look in the news, look how many charters have been busted for spending student dollars, right? That little backpack full of cash on luxury trips abroad, on just ridiculous things that have happened, and the quality of education, right? And so I just urge people to really do their research. I'm not a charter school expert, and there are plenty of people out there who are, who would be better resources, but just really know what is the full intention of that school.
Yeah. And we have a comment from Trisha Cole, and she is in Texas. And she says, working at a charter school when I returned to Texas, the board and CEO were a joke when understanding education. So that's her experience. And what I know about Trisha, she works in Title I schools.
Mm-hmm. So when you look at that board, so in a private, not for-profit charter, you literally can have someone from the business world. Let's say she was a CEO of some Fortune 500 company, can come in, have zero educational experience, and open up a school with students, right? And then say, I am here for the kids and for their education. But when you look at school districts and school boards and look at superintendents, we don't hire superintendents who just came from Fortune 500 companies with zero educational experience, right? And so why? Why is it that we don't do that? If it doesn't matter, why don't we do that in public schools?
Yeah, and it's also an opportunity for people within communities and other private, just like depending on everyone has their own intent, but I think it's an opportunity for others who want to contribute and who are able to contribute to consider building schools within communities where if the public school system or the existing schools are failing them, so that's something that's kind of like on the check advocacy. If you're looking to, I don't know who's watching this, and you never know what people have access to, or if they're philanthropists or different things like that. So that's one thing that that I suggest and that I'm thinking of, and what I'm thinking of now, right, is freedom schools, and then even like Saturday school. We're going to close out, but before we do, what advice would you give to uh, parents, caregivers, and guardians of students?
I think when we as educators come into the field, we do come in with the mindset that we're here for the students. And I think as parents, when you send your children to school, you assume that educator that's in front of your child is truly doing what's best for your child. But I think as parents, you can't assume that anymore. You have to go in and talk to the teacher. You have to go in and become part of PTA. And if that means, look at COVID-19 has really taught us you can do anything virtually. If that means you suggest virtual meetings at 6 p.m. because people can't make it during the day, like my own school, my student school, 8:30 PTA meetings. I got to go to work. I can't do it. But if you allowed me to attend virtually, right, I could make it later in the day. And so I think as parents, you have to research and find out what solutions work for your families and your community. But more importantly, you need to be talking to each other. You need to be sharing that knowledge that you learned with your neighbors. Like, hey, I know you couldn't go to the meeting, but this is what I found out. And I think if we could build communities and organize them and organize themselves, not even us as educators organizing the community, but assisting when asked, you can be your child's advocate and staying involved, going to school board meetings, listening to them online, whatever you need to do that works for you. And not being scared to speak up. That's huge. And so just really sharing and communicating with the community what's going on in schools.
Okay. And I think that the message that you gave is also a good message for the individuals who are stepping up as leaders within their respective communities, who are and who will be running for office. These are some issues that should be brought to the table, and your leadership would be needed in these areas as far as organizing communities and empowering parents. Advice to teachers.
You are not their savior. It's not your job to save any of these kids. It is your job to educate, to listen, to grow, and to provide all of the services you can that will benefit all of your students, and to really take into account what families need. And at this time, my union plug is going to be, it is your job as a rank and file member, as an educator, to step up and push your associations to do more than bargain for salary and benefits. It is your duty to bargain for the common good, to bargain for what is best for that entire community and student population, as well as teachers. Yes, I believe you need a living wage. I do believe teachers deserve to be paid for what they're doing every day. But I also believe smaller class size, we need to talk about that more. More counselors, those things need to be bargained in the contract so that districts are required to follow them. It will benefit everyone.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie Tellez, for joining me today. And for all of you that are watching, if you want to learn more about me, you can visit my website at shawntajackson.com. And Trisha, she agrees with you and she says yes.
So thank you, Trisha. Thank you, Shawnta. This was great.
Thank you. Thanks for I wish we can talk longer and go on, but I know we have to go on with our
part 2 in a couple weeks. They'll be fine.
Yeah, I was like, I didn't ask the COVID-19 question. How did you deal with the transition? And then I'm thinking about equity and kids getting laptops and not getting laptops, or they don't have access to Wi-Fi, or they don't even have the electricity, even if they did get the supplies from the school. Everyone has all these different issues. And then most kids receive the mental health services in school. So now they're not receiving the mental health services. And then think about meals. Some kids, they only go to, their only meal for the day sometimes is at school. But I do know a lot of communities are coming together and they're responding to those needs. But that's another conversation for another time. It's like, how do we just eliminate that? There's always going to be people in need, but there are a lot of people out here who are silently suffering, and because of COVID-19. But I'll end on that note because I can keep going and going. But again, thank you so much for this very engaging, constructive, and productive conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You too. Bye.
Bye.